All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Outside the Studio. I'm realizing this is quite the eclectic podcast because the conversation we are about to have today is not a topic that we've addressed yet so far. It's a topic that has always been on my mind, I would say, even since I was a little kid, in terms of feeling like they're noticing at a young age that there was a difference between those of us who have and those of us who have not. And I remember feeling this very acutely. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but hopefully my guest will help me out with this fact check. And that was when I believe we were in the Gulf War. I think George Bush Sr. was president, and I was learning about what war actually meant. And my father, who is my guest today, so without further ado, I'll introduce David Benedicktus, my father, who has been on the podcast before, repeat guest, but this is a very different topic, as I was mentioning. And I'm just going to tell this brief story, and then we'll get into the meat of the subject. So I was learning about war. I want to say I was about 7 during the Gulf War.
That was, you were talking about 92, the 90?
Yeah, 92.
Oh, the first Gulf War.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you were trying to explain to me, I think you're trying to explain to me what war meant. And all I really remember is that I was having a hard time comprehending why I felt like I lived in relative safety. And somewhere out there in the world, there were children my age, younger, older, who were in danger of having bombs dropped on their head. And I remember that being kind of like one of those seminal points in my life where I was like, well, why am I lucky to live here in this country or in this part of the world where I get to live in relative safety? So that felt like a kind of a juxtaposition of the haves and the have-nots in my little 7-year-old brain. We'll call it a 7-year-old brain. So fast forward to today, and Pops, I'd like you to add in where I'm leaving out, because I've introduced you before in a different context, but you also have this background of working with marginalized communities. I mean, that's been a big part of your life's work from my point of view. And right now, currently in your life, you're working with the Council for Homeless, which is a local, I believe it's a nonprofit organization for Clark County, the City of Vancouver. And what I think is really cool that you're doing with them is one thing, if not more than this, is when you get together with your band and play music, all the proceeds for that live music goes to the Council for Homeless.
Yep.
So what else do you want to say about that this realm of work, this body of work that you've been doing for some time?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to tag, we can come back to it, but just tag that you were somewhere between 7, 8, 9, the first Gulf War, and somewhere in that period, the Daddy Bush War, and I'm pleased to hear as a father and as a parent that you were open to thinking about that kind of thing as a kid, and I think that's important for parents to, in an age-appropriate way, to let kids know that they've won the national lottery, right? That they live in a country where they don't have to worry about bombs dropping on them or attacks, and so then going back to my parents, and actually my father and my first stepmother, Carol Flom, we were living in the Los Angeles area. This was the 1963, 4, 5, 6 era. And they got involved in the civil rights movement. And in fact, and then Carol, with the support of people that were continuously meeting in our living room, raised money for a bunch of people to go back and march in the last Selma March, Civil Rights March with Martin Luther King, where they crossed the bridge and dogs were on leashes, threatening them and stuff. And as a follow-up to that, going back to the homeless piece, when they got back from that, they then got involved in the homelessness um, initiative in California. And that at that point, it was a civil rights issue in terms of people of color not have access to housing that they were discriminated against. And that was eventually passed in 1968, 69 in California. So I had that, I was a teenager at the time. I graduated from high school in 1967 and John Marshall High School in Los Angeles. So all of that was the ferment, the Watts riots that happened and stuff was going on. And I had that kind of consciousness and heard names like Gandhi and peace and nonviolent protest and all those kind of things. I was kind of marinated in that as a kid. So that's why I'm such a progressive liberal person. And I also, I was attracted to Buddhism and stuff like that when I was when I was like 18 or 19, when I was in Los Angeles City College. It was kind of interesting stuff, which was weird because I was baptized Catholic, and then my stepmother was a Reformed Jewish person. We were living in a neighborhood next to a Methodist minister, and I think I was 14 at the time, and they were sponsoring a fellow young man who was 16, so he's a few years older than I was, to come to the United States and live in the United States from the what was called the Belgian Congo at the time, or Zaire now. And they couldn't find a place for him to go in the whole church. But we took him in, and he became my roommate for 2 years. Asa Desengamoka. He lives in San Diego now, and he's got an engineering degree. He was very enamored with my dad being an engineer, working for the Metropolitan Water District and stuff. So he stayed in the United States, and I actually saw him after my parents passed in 2008 or 9 or something like that. My brother and I got to meet him again. So, but that was, so there was that, not only talking about, but doing something about it, culture in my family. So.
Well, I think I'm so curious about not only the talking about it, but the then doing something about it culture, because it feels to me, and I'm curious what it looks like from your point of view, that our current culture, even my generation, feels rather apathetic. We talk a lot about this isn't fair. This is, what's the word today? Social justice warrior, which it sounds like somebody, it's kind of a derogatory term today.
It's rather pejorative, yeah.
Right? Whereas I don't think that in the context of your growing up, that wouldn't have been a derogatory term. It might have been like a badge of honor to say, yeah, I'm not only am I talking about it and doing something, or not only am I talking about it and caring about it, but this is what I'm doing about it.
Well, that was a really pivotal moment in the culture, was that awareness about what was the racism and how many people were treated as other than or not quite human. But there were other pejorative terms. We were called communists or socialists.
That's true. Yeah.
And especially communists. And in fact, and that same term, those same names and labels are being applied today when we're talking about Kamala and Tim Walz and their initiatives. Anything that has to do with taking care of other people is being called communist and socialism. So yeah, so getting to the apathy question about how to move people from saying, well, there's no hope, or I think people are kind of living in despair, that they feel just so disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
And they it's they're not sure about how to plug in, where to plug in. It's like my free association, as we're talking, is to when the 11 years that I was involved with our neighborhood association, and the I was the we had 9 council members, and then we had 4 officers on board. So what we did was we created a structure for people in the neighborhood to come and do things, and we advertised that. Right. So they didn't have to be on the council. They just said, we're going to have a neighborhood cleanup over here on such and such a day. We need this, this, and this. Or I just got a text from the former chair of the neighborhood association. We started doing this thing, adopting the local elementary school. So we have we have we have volunteers that come from the neighborhood to the local school on the days the kindergartners come in, and the teachers and the staff need extra assistance to help direct people and be a warm, smiling, caring face to new kindergartners that are in a new place. It's a simple thing, but you have to have that relationship. You have to build those relationships and partnerships with community to give them a place to plug in. Or there's a big movement like back in the civil rights movement, but the there is an orchestrated, a scripted effort that's been going on for at least 50 years, pushing back against that idea that we're all one people and that we need to take care of each other. That came through in the 60s and 70s, and then there was the start of this, what I call this kind of Christo-fascist movement that came out of the what is called the Christian prosperity doctrine, is that if you follow these tenets, then you'll have prosperity and riches and stuff like that. So they kind of turn the Christian religion about caring for each other into you're poor and you're suffering because you're not following the tenets of this particular religion.
Mm-hmm. On that thread, I want to talk about I want to talk about homelessness or the unhoused.
Yeah.
In our neck of the woods, in our community, which is, I think, very much a microcosm to the macrocosm of this thing that you're talking about. And I guess I would share a recent experience that I just shared with you, Pops, is what prompted this conversation in particular, although it's in the back of my mind regularly because, like my father just shared, I grew up with that same mentality of, Tara Brach calls it bad othering. And I have always tried to look at someone and put myself in their shoes, whoever it is. I don't care who you are. You're a janitor at a school. You're living in a tent on the sidewalk. You're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. You're cutting in front of me in your BMW. I don't care who you are.
You're coming in front of me, all bets are off.
But I've always tried to have empathy and understanding and the ability to put myself in another person's shoes and walk my life with a certain level of confidence and feeling like I'm not a victim. And that's something that you taught me from a young age because you were doing work with the criminal justice system when Megan and I, my sister, we were young. And, I think at that point in time, you were trying to walk this line between maintaining this level of empathy and working with marginalized people, but also receiving all of these like crime reports all the time and feeling like probably how do I keep my family safe? How do I protect my young girls? And also do this work and be empathetic and be open. And I just feel like that's probably a hard line to walk. And having had this recent experience where I was attacked in my car driving through Portland, somebody walked off the sidewalk, came into the street, walked onto the hood of my car, started punching my windshield. In 2 punches, the windshield just completely shattered. And then kind of just like as quickly as this happened, it all just stopped happening. And I kind of just sat there in shock for a moment thinking, what should I have done? What should I have done? What should I have done in that moment? And I kept having this conversation with myself all day. Like, could I have done something better in that situation to protect myself? And also, what was going through that guy's head? And trying to have this conversation about separating this person from the action and understanding that hurt people hurt people. I mean, this person is not in their rational, logical thinking mind to do something like that. Something's chemically imbalanced, whether it's a drug they took or a chemical imbalance because of some neurological condition.
Mm-hmm.
But my takeaway was, how do I protect myself from a situation like that? Number one, but also this being the microcosm of the macrocosm. Now, when I go out into society, when I go drive around in Portland, when I go for a walk by myself, I honestly have a little bit of PTSD, and I don't want to live my life in fear. And I also don't want to start looking at every person from this lens of suspicion. I don't want to be naive, but I also want to maintain my empathy. I want to maintain my ability to all of these qualities that I grew up with that I feel like are really important to have, because as a society, I don't think that we're only as good as, what is that saying? We're only as good as the lowest of the low. Like, if we can't help lift each other up and prosper together, then I don't think we're doing that well as a society.
The society is known by the way it cares for its poor and marginalized people.
Yes, thank you.
So just going back to my career experience working as a mental health nurse, actually even before I got my degree from the University of Colorado in '79, when I got out of the Navy, I was knowing that I wanted to go into some kind of psychology or mental health degree, and I was able to get take the experience I had in the 4 years in the Navy working as a psychiatric foreman, psych tech, and pass a state certification process so that I started working in the mental health system in San Francisco right at the time all of the deinstitutionalization was happening of the state hospitals, which led to an overwhelming of the group and boarding care homes and an overwhelm of the mental health system. And I was working in the crisis center at the San Francisco Medical Center, Langley Porter Institute, right across from Golden Gate Park, where a lot of homeless people would live. It's a great park to live in, fairly temperate weather most of the time, except when it got foggy and cold in the winter. And we lived right across the park, and I would walk through it every day to work and back home at night, and then in the evening. And then my wife Donna and I would go there in the weekends, and all the time homeless people would walk up to me. Some would recognize that I was a safe person to talk to or something like that. I just thought, that's kind of interesting. I seem to get a lot of people just coming up to me and feeling like they can talk and stuff, and I would engage them and stuff. And if I had any money, I'd give it to some people. But going back to while I'm telling the story about Langley Porter Institute, what we realized back then, and we've never brought forth into policy. Well, we've made policies, but we've never taken the next step of fully funding it forever. This idea of community-based health care, public health for people that are can't live without some kind of structured environment, and then calling them either they're lazy or they're just not interested in caring for themselves. and then throwing up your hands. Well, you can't save everybody, that kind of thing, right?
Well, can I stop you right there? Because I think this is an important point, because it's an argument that I hear a lot from the folks that don't understand how homelessness can be so ubiquitous, how it can happen so easily, how I honestly believe that so many of us are a lot closer to being in that situation than we think we are. I mean, especially if you're somebody who, like maybe you don't have healthcare, maybe you're on private healthcare. You could be one accident or chronic disease away from being in that situation yourself. So I wonder if we could explain a little bit around the reasons why there is so much homelessness.
Well, one of it is the way we apportion the richness of the richest country in the world. And I was just reading this little article. I highlighted some of the things here. This was from New York Times in March of 2023. A third of the country's people, the United States, make less than $55,000 a year. Many are not officially counted among the poor, but there are plenty of economic hardship above the poverty line. And then the supplemental poverty measure, which accounts for government aid and living expenses, more than 1 in 25 people 65 and older live in deep poverty in 2021. 65 and older seniors, they're living just barely clinging on with their Social Security. And programs like housing assistance and food stamps are effective and essential. Everybody knows that that's helpful. But the United States devotes this is the critical piece, but the United States as a first world country devotes far fewer resources to these programs as a share of its gross domestic product. And that's a conscious decision to other people and say that they're not deserving of that money or that they need to work for it, which is true in some ways, but they need to have structure to do that. And we're going to get into the neuroscience of all this, which is something that you just alluded to about brain and what causes people to act in the way that they do. But the United States devotes fewer resources to these programs as a share of its domestic product than the other rich democracies. So on the eve of the COVID epidemic in 2019, our child poverty rate was roughly double that of several First Nations, including Canada, South Korea, and Germany. So we could fund powerful anti-poverty programs through sensible tax reform just by asking the billionaires and the super rich, the 1%, to pay the taxes that they owe. They don't, because they have all these little boutique ways of getting out of paying the taxes. And so that would add 175 billion. This is back in 2019 numbers. That would add 175 billion to something that we could use to address that and to create housing initiatives and buy housing and build structural support and case management. You probably heard about the concept that's come out of housing first. It used to, when I worked in mental health and then in running the victim services program for the Clark County Juvenile Court that you alluded to in the criminal justice work that I've done. The thing that people needed most was a safe place to live, but the bar was so high they had to be off drugs, they had to be on mental health drugs, they had to control their behavior. And now we switched that around in many communities, and housing is first, and then we pour in resources, wrap our arms around them, wrap around programs, wrap around initiatives are where you decide what the person needs and you get a team around them and case management and doctors and nurses, occupational therapists, job trainers, whatever, or workplace mentors and things like that, just the whole continuum. So I was right in the center of all of that, worked for a little while when we lived down in the Corvallis, Albany area. I was working in a day treatment center, and we poured all those services into those people that would come to that and went back out to their houses. That's when I started doing a lot of more home visits when I worked in community health. So it's, in other words, the money's there. We're deciding those people aren't deserving of it, which is that they're not. What Father Boyle was that?
Yeah, Father Gregory Boyle.
Well, right. He was
This is
talking about the dilemma between our religious moral dictums that we grow up with about being good people and taking care of other people, but somehow withholding what they really need because we feel that they're not deserving enough, versus not understanding that it's all about the neuroscience. If you, so, put a plug in here for Robert Sapolsky, a primatologist and neuroscience out of Stanford. His new book, Determined. Go online, go on YouTube and Google and type in Sapolsky and determined, and it'll come up. A discussion will come up, and you can watch an hour video of it. But the idea is that you would be the exact same person as that guy that jumped up on your hood and smashed your windshield if you had the life that he had, the same interuterine environment, the same genetic history going back 3, 4, 5 generations that then led to him having a brain that was so stimulated and um, so um, uh, threatened in some way. Who knows what was going through his head, but something happened that triggered him. You would be that same person if you had his life. That's what the neuroscience is saying. That's for ADD, ADHD, schizophrenia, all those things, everything like that, and the lack of empathy and compassion, like our former president Trump. We need to have that same kind of compassion that Father Boyle is talking about, understanding that that person needs assistance and help, but we have to be smart about how to deliver that to them and not let people who have that sociopathic tendency to be in positions of power.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where, I mean, the impetus behind this conversation was that instant happened. And then the same night I went home, my dad was referring to this conversation that Tara Brock has on her podcast with Father Gregory Boyle. And I'll link that podcast to the show notes. But the title of this podcast is Cherishing Each Other.
Yeah.
And I want to highlight the cherishing each other, because the work that Father Boyle does is what we're talking about here. I mean, he runs a community, I believe it's in LA.
Yeah, it is.
Homeboy Industries.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's been doing this for a while now in a gang-riddled environment. I believe it was during the decade of death that this came about.
Yep. And I started in 1988. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly the point, is I believe it. I saw that guy coming at me, and it looked like he wanted to just rip his skin off. Like, I can't imagine how uncomfortable it was to be in his body at that time. Did I want to be in his way? No. I happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. But my takeaway from that, like I said before, is not how do I go around with my blinders on and protect myself from something like that again. Yeah, sure, I don't want to be a victim, but I want to understand how, as a society, we've gotten to where we are. And I think conversations like this are really important to foster empathy, to understand that you and I are not as different as we may seem. And yeah, you put me in that guy's situation, that his home life, his childhood, I bet you, yeah, absolutely, I'd be that angry. I'd be that upset. I'd be that pissed off. I'd be that stimulated all the time. And I am pissed off when I look around and I see that I have this relative. I've always been like this. Like I was saying before, I don't understand why I can sit in a relative place of privilege and comfort, and across the street there's a homeless camp. Why is there that level of disparity? It doesn't seem fair.
You won the genetic lottery.
Right, but what do we do with that? I mean, there's got to be some reason for that, right? So what is then my purpose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what I think I see you doing it right now, and that's trying to cultivate compassion and have people around you that have that same uh, ethos and can feed that back to you, and then hook up with initiatives in the community where you can then live that out. Now, it takes. Now, one of the things you'll hear when you listen to Sapolsky is that this is not easy work. It's hard work every day because when someone cuts you off, in a BMW or even in a Subaru, uh, you know, they, they my response, depending on what my mood is that day, is to perhaps to curse them a little bit and say, "What the hell," or or go back to my um, calmness and go, well, that person's having a bad day, or I'm glad that didn't, I'm glad I was able to see that coming. I, I'm thinking about a time just happened within the last 6 months. I was going down a surface street coming from downtown home, one I always take, and there's a lot of side streets coming in. This is a two-lane street, but there's side streets coming in. This person pulled out was going to turn right in front of me, and they would have T-boned me. He stopped. He had a passenger in his car. I was by myself, and he was coming like this, and I was going like that, and we both stopped. Probably 6-10 feet from each other, but we were both looking at each other, and I said, "Good job." We saw each other and went on the way. I didn't flip him off or curse him and stuff like that. I said, "Oh my goodness, isn't that was close?" So there's that kind of reactivity that can be channeled. I mean, you got your lower brain where you're reactive. You react and you slam on the brakes and honk your horn or whatever. But then the next thing is a choice about this is another human being that made a mistake that didn't, was there, didn't do it on purpose. And I try to do that. I've lived in the neighborhood here for 38 years, and there's been some families that are challenging at times and didn't have uh, the what Kamala called the affirmative actions. No, that wasn't Kamala. That was Michelle Obama. Said the affirmative actions of generational wealth. Because my parents passed that on to us because my father just happened to win the genetic lottery and was born at a time that he got the GI Bill when he got out of World War II. And there was also all of this money flooding into housing, VA housing for everybody, except for Black people and brown people. But that's also the story of where we're at, right? Is that people have been marginalized and kept other. But this idea that I think about those people who are still in the neighborhood, and every day I just think, I hope their lives are going to be okay. I hope they get the help they need, and blessings to them. And so it helps me shift my interactions with them when I have that from one of, God damn, that's why can't they?
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
think that's important to highlight that it is really a practice.
It is, yeah.
It's a practice of, we're going to be human. We're going to have our moments where we're going to react without thinking. And maybe in hindsight, we're like, ooh, I wish I would have done that differently.
Yeah.
But then the practice becomes inviting in the pause. And I'm going to use Tara Brach again because I just love her.
Inviting them to pause.
The sacred pause. She calls it the sacred pause. And which in many different modalities, spiritual modalities, it's the idea of creating it's the idea of creating space between stimulus and response. So meditation practice can do that, breath work can do that. Surrounding yourself by oxytocin-rich environments can help you do that. All of those things can help you do that. But it really is a practice and a conscious choice you can start making, and a neural pathway that you can grow and groove. There's so many different ways I want to go with this conversation, because your background and your education and your life experience is so rich in all of these things, and PTSD and trauma-informed lens is one of
So
them.
that's the trauma is the key here, is that the people who we're talking about who are on the margins have experienced significant trauma, either emotional, genetic trauma, environmental trauma, or the trauma of unrelenting, sucking poverty, where every day is survival, which changes your brain structures. And when I had the chance, again, just luck, I was, I came into working in, uh, at the juvenile court in their victim offender mediation program, which eventually became their serving all victims victim services program for 10, and I did that for 10 years. And the idea there was to understand that these these young people and their families were not doing the behaviors. Most of the prior to the understanding of trauma informed practices, trauma informed interventions, was that you want to change people's behaviors because you didn't want them to do bad things, right? You wanted to make better choices. Well, so out of that movement, which um, uh, also evolved into helping people with challenging behaviors, and the wraparound model was they can't, so they don't have the resources, they can't do it, so they won't. And then the challenge is, what kind of resources does that individual need? So I was in charge prior to doing the juvenile court work. I worked for 3 or 4 years coordinating mental health services for the chronic ill population. Part of that was finding housing for people who would come out of state hospitals or out of the correction system. And no one wants that in their neighborhood, right? Oxford houses or whatever. People are afraid of that. The others are they going to have enough resources or support? Which are legitimate questions, and usually people don't. People are concerned because there haven't been enough resources. There was just an article in the Columbia last week about the housing first complexes. There's five. I think there's five or six of them now throughout Clark County, or in the city, and they're experiencing problems because they're not secure buildings. So there's a lot of people that get into housing, but then the people that with drug addictions come in around the housing complexes and are creating problems for people that are now in the housing and are trying to escape drug addiction and homelessness. So there's a dilemma there, right? So you have to have case management services and security buildings so people feel safe. And there's all sorts of stories that come from listening to people to provide services for the unhoused people who are going into housing. That it's such a change for them. Like the one woman that was being interviewed, I believe her last name was Leonard, about the Housing First apartment that she has. The first week that she was in the apartment, she couldn't sleep in the apartment. She slept in her car. What is that about? Or the other thing is, people would sleep in the closet. They sleep on the floor. They couldn't sleep in the bed. So that is a conditioning that involves the brain. That's a trauma response to being in a survival mode. And that changes your brain chemistry. It wipes out, it overwhelms the prefrontal neocortex, which is in charge of reasoning and decision making and being safe or not. And it's all lower brain stem and the middle brain, the emotional centers of the brain, which is all around risk, flight, or fight kind of thing, hormones. So, I mean, we know the neuroscience, we know all of that, we know how to help people. We just have to change our economic system so that we take care of people, and everything will be better from that, and do that in a compassionate way. And I had, listening to Father Boyle, it reminds me of when I worked as a serious violent crime facilitator for the state of Oregon, and would go into the Oregon penitentiary system and go beyond this gate and that gate and that gate. It was closing and opening, closing and opening, and you had to be oriented to being safe inside the penitentiary system, where I was doing groups with the chaplains there on restorative justice and how people can be accountable for what happened and understand and be. And this was a restorative justice program that practiced that same ethic and ethos that Tara and Father Boyle were talking about you're a human being, you're more than just what you did. There are options. And then I got involved in the communities that were helping them find housing and resources afterwards. And there's studies that show that people who have mental health services when they're coming out of institutions, not on a waiting list like they have now for, a couple of months or whatever, but wait until we have available openings, but they actually get services. That cuts down incarceration recidivism by 59%. Just that simple thing of mental health services. But imagine having housing, supported housing, and treating people with trauma-informed neuroscience, evidence-based approaches, and have people compassionately saying, what happened to you, not saying that's bad, you should do something different, but asking people, what happened to you that's something that, which you were doing when that guy, shortly after that guy pummeled your windshield, was like, man, what happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. I think, well, and I'm thinking about the work you do with the lunch buddies too, when you're
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
I'd love for listeners to get to hear that story, because I think that's a really good, tangible, if someone's listening to this and they're like, well, yeah, I want to get involved. How do I get involved? And you were saying it can be simple. I think we feel overwhelmed in our day and age by all of this input. We get input all the time, and we're hyper connected in a way, but we're so lonely in so
Good
many
point.
ways.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to share your lunch buddy story.
Well, the Vancouver School District and most school districts in Washington, or at least in Southwest Washington, I know about, have a program that's sponsored by the school district called the Lunch Buddy Program. And that's run through the family resource centers that provide services to kids that are homeless or have struggle in the schools. This is in elementary schools primarily. There's a different mentoring programs for older kids, but this is in the elementary schools, first, second, third grade, kind of, and even older, all the way up to fifth grade, where you go through a background check. It's a simple thing you do online through the Vancouver School District. Check and see if your school district has it, and you can go through and they do a background check and you get the response within a day or two, or sometimes within hours. So that approves you as a person that can go in, and then that's sent to the school, and then you sign up for their lunch buddy program, which our local elementary school has, and then they send a note out to the parents and say, we have a lunch buddy that would like to meet and have lunch with your child once a week for 45 minutes and eat lunch together, and they will play with them and talk with them and do activities and stuff like that. This is something that you as a lunch buddy are just dedicating your time to being with that child, seeing that child, listening to that child, and hearing what that child says. That's one of the things that we need as human beings. We need to be seen, we need to be heard, we need to be acknowledged. And that often doesn't happen in families that have a lot of chaos and are in a survival mode in our community. So many of these kids are homeless. They're living in shelters or sometimes in car during the day, and then they can only go to the shelter at night after 6 o'clock. So there's all this chaos and stuff in their lives. And to have someone dedicated to them that just plays Legos or draws or something like that. The Family Resource Center community rooms are full of all these toys and stuff that kids get to play with. And you just follow the kid along and says, well, what do you want to do today? Here's all this stuff. And they'll pull something out. And I can be down on the floor playing dolls or filling food baskets or cooking, or I could be drawing with kids, or I could be playing Legos or Battleship game or Sorry or whatever the game is. But the idea is that you're dedicating that time focused on that child, and it makes a huge difference in their lives. It gives them a feeling of being special and seen. To be seen and to be heard. Number one, developmental.
Yeah. I think that we can underestimate the impact that one really simple gesture can have in someone's life.
45 minutes a week. Yeah.
Even less than that. I mean, I think about the things, as a child that impacted me, that stuck with me. Sometimes it was just a phrase. Somebody, an adult, a mentor that I looked up to said something nice to me that, like you're saying, made me feel seen, made me feel valued, and made me feel like, oh, that person noticed that I'm good at that thing. Like your lunch buddy's good at drawing. And despite his chaotic environment, all quote unquote evidence might suggest that this child is at risk, and maybe he is, but you're a person in his life who's showing up, telling him and seeing him as somebody who's valuable, as somebody who has this skill. He's good at drawing. He's really good at drawing. And as that small child getting that message, who knows where that message could take him?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. So I talked with the Family Resource Counselor, and I said, did you see this boy's drawings? I mean, he's 7 years old, 8 years old or something. And I said, look at this. I mean, he's doing it. He's not tracing it. He's just doing it, doing it and repeating it. And he can do anything like that. I said, and so then what happened was the Family Resource Coordinator talked with the mother about that and talked about, there's art schools for opening up for K through 5 kids to be involved in an art program. Or you might think about later on when he was, in middle school. I tried to get both you and Megan to go to art school, but you guys didn't want to do that. But I want to stay with my friends.
Probably the biggest regret of my life, just so you know. Biggest regret right there. Live in person.
I want to stay with her. So the sweet young boy. So what I did was I took pictures of all the art that he made. And then what I did was I brought him home and uploaded him on my computer. And then I made him a booklet out of it at the end of the semester, when the end of the summer, and I gave that to him so he could have that. So those kind of things. I mean, as a community member, well, first of all, as an older fella, one of the things that they say is in terms of preventing cognitive decline, hanging out with young kids is one of the best things you can do, because it engages you, it increases your empathy quotient, and it helps rewire your brain. And especially if you're helping them to do algorithms in the 5th grade, being a math tutor or something like that, which I did for a little while. And I had to actually study on every week beforehand what the lesson was. So there's all these places to plug in the community. Go do it. You'll feel good, and you're going to make a difference in someone's life. And then you're going to say, I'm going to vote for more of that in policy. We need more help for kids.
Is there anything else you wanted to mention about the Council for Homeless? Anything in general? I mean, I know that our audience is broader than the Pacific Northwest and Clark County in particular, but anything that you wanted to cite with the work that you do there?
Well, I'm not. I play music in the community as a way to bring people together. In fact, there's a foundation that I was I've been promoting for years, and that actually got me thinking about this, called Playing for Change. It's the foundation to build music uh, schools, or having music programs in schools all around the world. So it got professional musicians together to raise money to do that, and they have music programs in third world countries all around the world. And so on that idea, I thought, well, we can get people together. And people are liking the music my friend and I are playing. So, and they're giving us money for that. We won the nationwide genetic lottery, and we don't need that money. So why don't we dedicate that to something in the community? And the Council for the Homeless, we both thought, oh, the Council for the Homeless, that'd be a good thing to do. And having worked with finding housing for people, I know how hard the Council for the Homeless works to educate people and to find winter shelters for people when there's 50, I don't know how many days there were of inclement weather where people were freezing to death on the streets. So they found shelters for people. They work with churches and other community resources to get people into temporary housing. Now, they support the shelters, but they also are promoting building out houses and supported living in the community. So we're lucky to have such a strong nonprofit in Clark County. And we just need more resources and in the community to address that. And to the credit, the city council is really doing a great job with that. And in the in the and we're eventually, we'll be able to address that. But what we did was this was actually a conscious decision that was made back during the Reagan administration to say that it wasn't a big problem and that really just the churches could take care of it. They cooked the books on what the actual numbers were, and they wanted to cut back on social programs and reduce the deficit because they were in a recession. So what's on the chopping block first? Social programs, mental health services, chemical dependency services, outreach to the poor, right? And that's just the opposite. We should have been asking the billionaires to contribute a little bit more because we got this problem over here. But that's been going on since the 80s. And people gotten this idea that, well, these people don't want help. Well, it's really that they don't want help. It's that the help you're offering them isn't the right kind of assistance. And then that comes into this idea of the understanding that if you had so much trauma in your life, you had a mother with maternal depression, you had physical and emotional neglect, emotional sexual abuse, substance abuse in your family, domestic violence, any of those, a combination of those, if you get 3, 4, 5, or 6 of them, your chance of having behavioral disorders and chemical dependency increases exponentially. For example, someone that has 6 of those experiences and flavor it with consistent poverty, you have a 4,600% chance of becoming a meth addict over someone that's had none of those, like yourself. So there's a direct correlation there. This was a study that was done all throughout the 90s. It was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And I happened to be at the juvenile court running the victim services program, along with some brilliant, compassionate people, Ernie Beachwhite and Eric. I'm blocking on Eric's last name, but those people brought in mental health services to the juvenile court and said, this is what we need to lead with, and we need to wrap around people, the services around families, and we need to bring trauma-informed approaches in. Eric Gilman was his name, and he retired as well. But we actually did the work that way. We changed people's lives by bringing together the systems to serve people in the point of crisis. We didn't say, you're bad, you got to go, got to go into detention. We said, well, what happened to you, and what do you need, and let's pull a team together to address that.
Well, and I think that's the takeaway of this conversation. I think if there's anything I want you to walk away with, it's that when you're out there in the world and you might not catch yourself right away doing the bad othering, judging someone else for the
No.
circumstances they find themselves in. But I encourage you to start to notice that, start to pay attention. I think it could a good visual trigger for this is you're at a stoplight, you see somebody holding a sign in the street, asking for money, asking for
Oh
food,
yeah.
whatever it is. What is your kind of thought process as you're looking at this person? I would urge you to think, what happened to them? Why are they in this situation? There are so many different reasons why. And I think that we're so, like I said before, we're so much closer to being in that same place than we actually think we are. And there is a really good, I'll have to find a link to this other podcast. It's an interview with LA City Mayor Trevor Noah did it on the What Now podcast, Trevor Noah's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And she's talking about the city of LA homeless problem. And she has a background in public health. And just like what you're talking about, Pops, is her solution to that crisis is healthcare, mental health services, healthcare, because in her experience, that one of the main drivers of somebody who does have that 50,000 job a year or less, like maybe they're working full time, and then they get a cancer diagnosis. Well, suddenly they are very quickly racking up doctor bills, and now they can't afford their rent, and now they're late to work because they're sick. And guess what? Next week, they're homeless. And guess what? When you're homeless on the street and you're worried about your safety at night, yeah, it makes sense that you would take meth or something to stay awake to keep yourself safe because you don't want to be raped. You don't want to be violently assaulted. It's a pattern. Like if you follow those breadcrumbs, you can easily see how it happens.
Medical debt. Well, so I I worked in the managed care system for 7 years, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then I mentioned the Medicaid uh, mental health population, chemical dependency population. But what you see when you look at how that's all funded is that the for-profit system is created to deny services and to reap profits for the shareholders rather than to get the services to people they need it for as long as they need it. And this conversation about universal health care or Medicare for all, that really needs to happen, because if you have medical debt, that'll force you into bankruptcy quicker. I mean, when you come out with $50,000 worth of medical debt because it isn't covered by your insurance, and thank goodness for the Affordable Care Act that made it more accessible to people. But it really is a huge issue. If you don't feel healthy, you don't feel well, you don't have mental health services, you don't have access to chemical dependency services through no fault of your own, that you're having a craving for drugs. Because what we found out through the adverse childhood experience is that the use of chemicals is related to people trying to control and mitigate the anxiety and the fight or flight hormones that they're continually flooded with. And without mental health services, and also we haven't had good mental health. We've never had really good mental health drugs. I mean, there's some that help a bit, but for the last 20, 30 years, there really haven't been enough research into getting better health drugs. And that's also combined with the support, the physical, emotional support, the lunch buddy kind of sitting down with, how's your day going? What do and the day treatment center I work in, that I was cooking with people, and I'd bring my guitar in and I'd play music and we'd sing along. I'd help people figure out how to make a spaghetti, and stuff like that. So those kind of supported living environments are just so valuable to people and make such a difference. And if you want to not see, I mean, the campaign locally here, we're got this these campaigns say, well, we don't want to have light rail coming across from that city over there because all the homeless people will come across and be and invade our city, and both of those cities that we live in, Vancouver and Portland, are working on the homeless issue as best they can, trying to get mental health services and chemical dependency services, but they're limited by the amount of funding that's available.
Mm-hmm.
So we know what works. We know why people are having those challenges, and we have to have the political will to do that. And we have enough money to do that as well. It's just reallocating it. Back in, I was looking at the taxes people pay. So after World War II, the tax rate was 71 to 95% for people in the 1% category. Now it's down to something like 30 or 20%, and if they pay it any at all, because there's ways to defer that and not have your capital gains taxed at all, never. So we built the highway system out of that kind of tax proportion. We didn't have a highway system before that. A big, the big freeway system and interstate system. That was Eisenhower that did that back in the 49, 50s, early 50s. And all the public health initiatives came out of that as well. And in the conversation about Social Security and Medicare and stuff like that, taking care of old people who used to have to live in the poorhouses and shelters before Social Security came along. Mm-hmm. So I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I hope it helps people feel a little bit more hopeful and someplace they can plug in, and to know that even if they can only offer an hour a week or in a month or something like it, makes a difference. And it'll certainly make a difference for them, seeing that, knowing that they're doing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rather than just being anxious and fearful about who's walking down their street and stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation and all of the sources we're citing. I'll make sure those links get into the show notes so that you can listen and read for yourself, and hopefully you feel like you can take some action based on this if you feel inspired to. That's my hope. Everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't, be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic musical genius, Drew Lovern. Thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.